How are you, everybody? Thank you for being here. As you can tell, my reputation precedes me in terms of, but we'll try to be effective and succinct with time. Sarah, you start, I think.
Right. It's great to be here, Javier. It's great to be here with you. Our relationship goes back almost a decade now, to when you and Malak came to visit me at Freedom House to hear about how we put together the Freedom in the World Index. And since then, I've also worked on the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index. And now I've had the privilege of being an advisor to the Tyranny Tracker. So tell all of us how we got from that day when you and I met to this launch today.
Thank you, Sarah. It was amazing to have met you. Well, in 2017. I was looking back in my email. I thought it was 2012 for some reason, but it was around 2017 when we came to your office. When we came to your office, we already kind of knew that we couldn't just peg ourselves. Thor explained a little bit of this to the existing indexes. I mean, the work that VDM, that the Freedom House, that International IDEA, and the Economist Intelligence Unit have done with their democracy indexes is amazing. And as he said, informs part of the work that we do. But we did identify that particularly the line between an eroding democracy that still has institutions to come back to a normal democracy, as opposed to eroding into a hybrid authoritarian regime, which then typically can lead to a fully authoritarian regime. We thought that that specific line perhaps needed a little bit of calibration, and we came up with a methodology to try to address that. But when we visited you, we already knew that we were probably wanted to come up with our own index, and when we came to you for essentially advice on how to build this responsibly, right? How to think about staffing of a project like this, how to think about expert meetings, consultants that need to come at specific parts of the process, and Freedom House being a leader in that, you really provided a lot of light, and you did it in such a selfless manner. Then when a few years after, we decided to move forward with the idea, we brought you on as a consultant. And so, but to close this part, one Freedom House anecdote, perhaps the main Freedom House anecdote, fun Freedom House anecdote, came only 2 years ago when I went to the DC office. I was talking to their Latin America officer, and I told him about the Tyranny Tracker. So I was like, "Hey, my colleague Adrian Chavez, a VP of research at Freedom House, who oversees the Tyranny Tracker work, he's there. He's passing by the aisle. You should talk to him." So I talk to him. I tell him we're coming up with this. I would love for you to, be a part of it. Come on. He looks at me in the eye and says, "Don't do it. You still have time to not do it." So he didn't mean don't bring, healthy competition to the world of democracy indexes. He meant this can be, very hard work that you have to sustain, maintain consistently over years, and it can be very ungrateful because it's out there, it's subject to criticism. People disagree on classifications, people don't like certain countries being labeled in a particular way. And so what I mean, I you probably can attest to that as well, no?
I can. Yes, I think he's right. Is this okay? Sorry, just make sure my mic's okay. Um, yes, absolutely. I agree with him. No, I mean the thing about this kind of work is that no matter how rigorous your methodology, someone is always going to say you got it wrong. And I think that just comes with the nature of what we're doing here. I can remember so many examples of governments reaching out to us, sometimes politely, sometimes not so politely, and wanting to point out what we had as incorrect information or to accuse us of being politically motivated. And then on the flip side, you have civil society who's saying, you're not being hard enough on our country. And in the end, no matter how seriously you take this, I think you're always going to disappoint someone. That's why, in the end, it's important to be really clear on the purpose. And I think that brings us back to the substance of the Tyranny Tracker. One of the things that's hardest in this type of work is identifying that tipping point when you have a gradual decline, but now you've gone from regular bits and pieces to erosion at a level where there's a structural shift underneath. And I really respect the Tyranny Tracker for not just laying out a set of interconnected pillars, but for asking a sharp core question that cuts through all of them. And that is, how do we know when a country has hit that point where there are no more checks? The executive is unconstrained when it acts in an autocratic way. So tell us about that.
So the key question is exactly that is that we follow is, has executive branch led democratic backsliding crossed the threshold where there are no meaningful checks on the will of the executive to just be authoritarian, as we see in the world today and has been mentioned in the speech by Professor Fukuyama. Even stable democracies exhibit signs of heavy erosion, and so determining that line is very important. And for us, and this came from the experience of working as litigators on behalf of dissidents around the world. Um, in our experience, both hybrid authoritarian regimes and fully authoritarian regimes have a judiciary that has already been taken by the executive in a way that it's impossible for the judiciary at that point to be an effective check on two types of abuses, particularly the abuse of going after political opponents, media outlets that are followed by these political opponents, and which ultimately has an effect, even if they don't touch specifically the electoral administrator, but it has an effect on electoral competition. So for us, that threshold is when the lack of judiciary work, the judiciary action in checking executive-led backsliding leads to to authoritarian regimes. Um, so and 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 so we've validated this. We've validated this in historically with the work that we did in Latin America. I know you want to say something about that, or I can start talking as my reputation precedes me about the Latin America.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess what I was going to ask is, conceptually, this all makes sense, right? But the real test of any index is, does it say something meaningful about what's happening on the ground? So, right, you anticipated my question is, where are the examples? Where have we seen this? And where have we seen it be a flag that's useful?
So when we knew we were onto something with the methodology was around 2010, we determined in Latin America that there were one fully authoritarian regime, a 50-year-old totalitarian dictatorship in Cuba. And we identified at the time as hybrid authoritarian regimes Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Ecuador. And what we saw in the years coming, and very importantly, we resisted the urge by activists on the right of the political spectrum that wanted us to put in that same mix of Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Ecuador. They wanted us to put Argentina, Brazil, because they had governments whose chief executive was very friendly with Fidel Castro and things like that. On the right, this is the right. On the left, they wanted us to include Mexico and Colombia, who at the time were governed by perceived center-right governments, who were, by the way, in a large measure, the target of a huge amount of human rights work from international organizations. So they were like, why don't you focus on Mexico and Colombia? We were like, no, we think the actual hybrid authoritarian regimes are this. Well, we think that history validated our initial determination. Why? Well, Cuba is now not the 50-year-old dictatorship, it's a 65-year-old totalitarian regime, longest dictatorship in the region. Venezuela and Nicaragua both transitioned into a full authoritarian regime. So we were onto something by calling them an authoritarian regime, a hybrid authoritarian regime. And then Bolivia had 20 years of a hybrid authoritarian regime that committed the first documented, since there's electoral observations by the OAS, electoral fraud in 2019, right? And that only came out after a bitter fight within the regime and amazing work by civil society activists, and a huge financial crisis and economic crisis that led to people voting the hybrid authoritarian regime out, which is an exceptional thing, but it can happen. And in the case of Ecuador, Ecuador was set up to do a Medvedev type transition into giving power back to Correa, but they got lucky that Lenin Moreno, the guy that they gave power to, actually turned their back on the authoritarian leader and was able to dismantle this authoritarian trajectory of the country. So we think the Latin America experience kind of validated that we were onto something, and 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 now we developed the full thing for the entire world.
Yeah. And so just to put a really fine point on this, it's not just about how competitive the elections are, it's about, are the institutional checks still functioning? Tell us about the judiciary and how that becomes a threshold in all of this.
As I mentioned earlier, the judiciary is a key point. I think for all of us, there is the notion that political scientists are big on of institutional accountability, and that goes everything. Elections are a form of institutional accountability. Intra-branch checks, the office of the legal counsel of the administration is a check. There is in countries like the U.S. there is a great system of administrative system that where there are intra-branch checks. But ultimately, we do believe that the main check is the judiciary. Does the Supreme Court or a constitutional tribunal, in the cases that are difficult, in the cases, for example, in this country, if the president of this country has floated the idea of getting reelected, potentially for a third time, which FDR did when the Constitution said a different thing. For example, if the Supreme Court did not check that potential abuse at some point, then definitely that would be a potentially a threshold crossing situation for a democracy like this. And examples like this exist all over the world. Typically, in the countries that you will see they're classified as hybrid authoritarian or fully authoritarian regimes are countries that have crossed that threshold. What the judiciary does not anymore is able to check abuses by the executive. So the predictability of the judiciary's decisions on cases that are important, not in any case in the periphery of politics, no, in the central cases of the political competition between an incumbent and the main political opposition, those decisions are the ones that matter the most for us.
I also want to point out that the qualitative nature of what we're doing here is is a real strength because we're not getting bogged down in, is this country a 3 or a 4? Because it's qualitative, we can take a step back, we can think more holistically, and we can really focus on, is the democratic system functioning? I think that elections are, they're a really important bellwether, but the really crucial point is, are the institutional checks still functioning? Um, I want to also give you a chance to talk about what the Tyranny Tracker doesn't do, because that can sometimes be as important or a highlight of what it does do. So tell us a little bit about that.
One thing that before I say what it doesn't do, what it's not, one thing that perhaps the label democracy that you see in the majority of the countries in the world there might be misleading, in that people might think that oh, democracies are rosy, great, everyone's happy. No, I invite you to check. When you check the democratic category within our index, you will see the signs of erosion of democracy in all of the countries that are described as democracies. I remember one early test that we did. A researcher came to us with like their kind of first test draft of the democracy in Norway. And it was like, oh, in Norway, all the institutions work. There's perfect checks on everything. Everyone comes to the street. And I was like, no, no, no. I've been in Norway 10 years. Norway is not like that. It's not a rosy situation. The left hates the right hates the left, and they're battling constantly in the court of public opinion. And so we need to reflect that. So we try to reflect the chaotic nature of democratic systems and how they hate each other and how it's difficult to maintain it, but yet when when institutions resist, we call it a democracy. So that's one kind of important footnote on how we see the democratic category. One thing we're not, and this is particularly important for this community where we have so many friends that are classical liberals, libertarians, donors in this space that care a lot about free markets and economic freedom. We're not an economic freedom index. We are a traditional, in that sense, political freedom index. So we don't measure the things that the Heritage Foundation's Economic Freedom Index or the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom Index measures, which include specifically property rights, the size of government, regulatory uh, intrusion by the government, tax issues, free trade. We don't measure that, but we do have a rationale for focusing on political freedom, and it is that we do think that overall, in the long arc of political evolution of societies, um, societies that have political freedom are more likely to outperform, and governments that have political freedom, democratic governments, outperform authoritarian regimes. And so we're actually going to have a talk that is going to end up coming after the sunset break by Professor Vincent Geloso, who is an expert at this. I'll introduce him in more depth later, but he will show how democracies outperform authoritarian regimes. And so that's what we're prioritizing. Thor mentioned it in one of the videos as well, prioritizing civil and political rights, prioritizing basic democratic rights as the standard that we try to measure here. And let me to finish this, Sarah, I was gonna say, so this is my first rodeo launching a democracy index ever. It's not your first rodeo, it's kind of like your third rodeo of sorts. And so take us away. I mean, tell the public, because I don't have experience in this, you do have the experience. What should they expect about the Tyranny Tracker in the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to just talk a little bit about how everyone who's listening right now can use it, right? Because the world right now is in a moment of really severe democratic decline. And I think everyone here wants to reverse that trend. We wouldn't be here otherwise. And I would encourage everyone to use the Tyranny Tracker for that purpose. Take a look at the top line stories and which countries are really under threat, and think about what influence do you have in your lives over those places, maybe in your work, maybe in your networks, maybe with your resources. And then delve into those country reports and take the time to see what's behind those top line stories, because that's where you're going to see where are the weak points, where are institutions pushing back, but they might need more support. What are the recent developments that might help inform what kinds of strategies might work best? Democracy support is an art, it's not a science. And that's why this type of nuanced qualitative analysis is really so important. So thank you so much for doing it and for
Thank you, Sarah, for being part of this team, and super important part of this team. And thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. Thank you.